Good afternoon. A couple of weeks ago, we started a story on Sacagawea, thinking that it would be good for us to hear stories about people who are different, and we've always been termed as different than we are. But Sacagawea was a Native American young woman who was asked to go along the journey of Lewis and Clark as an interpreter for the exploration of the Louisiana Purchase. And so as we start today, we're beginning chapter 4, and it's the beginning of the journey. And so let us travel with Sacagawea and Lewis and Clark. On Sunday, April 7th, 1805, the Corps of Discovery was finally ready to set off on their journey. Sacagawea wrapped up her baby, whom the men liked to call Little Baptiste, and strapped him to her back on a cradle board, which is a piece of wood with leather laces. Baptiste was snug and secure as Sacagawea said goodbye to Otter Woman, Charbonneau's other wife, and other friends she had made in the last 5 years. Then she got into one of the boats filled with a total of 32 people, equipment for the expedition, and Seaman, the dog. And we have a list here of the equipment that they needed. A couple of boats that are hollowed out with from a log with sails that make it easier for fishing and shallow rivers. They had canoes made from cottonwood trees. They had teepee materials. They used dried buffalo skins to tie around a dozen wooden poles. They had guns and ammunition, mapping instruments, medicine, and 14 bales of presents for Indians that they would meet on the way. Journals for writing, and yards of oilcloth to wrap the goods and keep out the dampness and the mold. Now, the Hidatsa and Mandan villages, those are different Indian tribes, slowly receded into the distance as the boats headed up the Missouri River. Lewis was filled with both hope and fear as they paddled toward the unknown. Remember, it was not like it is today. He had no idea what was going to happen, but he wasn't nervous at all. Entertaining as I do, the most confident hope of succeeding in a voyage, he wrote, I could but esteem this moment of my departure as among the most happy of my life. The expedition was difficult right from the start. Traveling west on the Missouri River, the Corps was going against the current. The paddling was exhausting and sometimes got so tough that the men had to get out and push the boats. Even though it was still spring, the river was still ice cold. As they pushed, the men's feet and legs would be freezing, as well as banged up from rocks and sunken logs. Sacagawea might not have pushed the boats, but the young woman quickly proved she was as capable and willing to help as anyone else on this expedition. And she was the only one who also had to tend to a newborn. She was especially good at gathering wild food, something the rest of the Corps didn't know anything about. Digging in the ground, she unearthed wild artichokes, licorice, and root that they called white apple. The men hungrily gobbled up whatever she found, since they needed all the nourishment they could get. Sacagawea wasn't just skilled at finding food. About a month after they left the Indian villages, they were traveling on the river when a sudden gust of wind hit the boat. The wind was so strong It pushed the boat on its side, and water began to rush in. Charbonneau panicked. Like most of the other men in the boat, who were also very frightened, he couldn't swim. Charbonneau, the most timid waterman in the world, as Lewis described him, grabbed the sides of the boat and started screaming and praying. Meanwhile, the boat, which also carried Sacagawea and her baby, was filling with more water and threatening to completely capsize. Lewis and Clark, who had been walking on the shore alongside the boats, fired their guns to get the men's attention, calm them down, and give orders. As Charbonneau wailed, they were terrified that all the medicine and other goods on board were going to wind up floating down the river. A few of the men began paddling toward shore, while others bailed water out of the boat to keep it from sinking. The captains breathed a sigh of relief and then noticed something remarkable. Among the hysteria, there was Sacagawea, calmly holding Baptiste in one hand and retrieving goods that had washed overboard with the other. If she was scared, she didn't show it. Because she maintained a level head, the Corps lost only a few items. Lewis and Clark recognized that Sacagawea was a special woman, both courageous and capable. In his journey, Lewis described her as having equal fortitude and resolution with any person on board at the time of the incident. The captains were so impressed that a few days later, they named a branch of the river after Sacagawea. Chapter 5, Danger Ahead. The boat accident was just the start of the trouble. Sacagawea was about to face death, and this time, she would have to depend on others to help her. In early June, Sacagawea came down with a terrible fever. Because they didn't have antibiotics yet, when someone had an infection, there was nothing to do but wait it out and hope for the best. Sacagawea was likely suffering from an infection as her fever rose higher and higher. Clark, who saw how much she was suffering, took care of her. He sat with her through the night, applying bark poultices. Those were soft materials applied to the body to relieve soreness or inflammation. He hoped they would make her better, but her condition worsened. The Corps had been waiting for Sacagawea to get better before they moved on, but they couldn't wait any longer. They had to push on if they were going to make it across the Rockies before camping for winter. Every day counted. So Clark laid Sacagawea down in a shaded spot in the pirogue. He administered 2 kinds of painkillers he had on the trip. But she continued to suffer, especially since she was in an uncomfortable boat, holding on to her baby, who was still breastfeeding. It seemed like a miracle, but a week after she came down with the fever, Sacagawea showed small signs of improving. Her recovery was slow, but eventually she started walking and sipping buffalo broth. Nobody was more relieved than Clark. During her illness, he and Sacagawea developed a special friendship. It became clear that he thought of her as a person, not an inferior. Remember, in those days, if you were a woman or of another race than white, you were considered inferior. He also cared about Baptiste, whom he described as beautiful and intelligent. After Sacagawea had completely recovered, she usually walked with Clark along the shore rather than riding in the pirogue. Any sense of ease they had didn't last long. Soon after she got better, the Corps of Discovery came upon the Great Falls of the Missouri River. The series of 5 waterfalls dropped the river a total of 612 feet. It was an amazing sight, the grandest sight I've ever beheld, Lewis wrote. The sun mixed with the mist of the falls to create beautiful windows. The falls were impressive, but they were also a real problem. There was no way the Corps could get their boats over them. The only option was to carry all their equipment and boats overland. Without any pack animals like horses or mules to help, it took over a month of backbreaking pushing, pulling, and heaving to get their gear around the falls. One day, while they were making their way around the falls, Clark, Sacagawea, Baptiste, and Charbonneau were walking along the riverbank when the weather suddenly turned stormy. The sky went steel gray and the wind whipped hard. A bad storm was brewing. Clark told everyone to move into a dry gully below them to take shelter under some overhanging rocks. They scrambled down as beating rain mixed with hail fell from the sky. Looking down at their feet, they realized the gully was filling with water. Clark, who normally dispensed good, sound advice, had led everyone into danger. A tidal wave of muddy, rocky water raged down the ravine, carrying boulders, tree trunks, everything else it could pull with it. The water was now up to their waists and getting stronger by the second. It was pushing them toward an 87-foot waterfall only a quarter mile away. Charbonneau filled and froze with fear. Clark had gotten them into this mess and he had to get them out. First, he shoved Charbonneau up the gully. Then he pushed Sacagawea with Baptiste up the slippery mud and rocks. Charbonneau pulled them up the rest of the way, and Clark quickly followed behind, making it over the end just before a flash flood filled the gully with raging water. Chapter 6, Home Again. Sacagawea was walking behind Lewis. Baptiste was snug and sleeping in his cradle board as usual. Passing a stream, bending around a pile of rocks, she had a funny feeling. The brush, the little islands in the water. Where had she seen them before? Suddenly it came to her. This was the place where she had been kidnapped. The Corps had arrived at Three Forks, the buffalo hunting grounds off the Shoshone, and the site where Sacagawea had been carried off by the Hidatsa years ago. She told the captains what had happened in this spot, and they grew excited. They must be near the Shoshone. They were eager to find Sacagawea's tribe because they needed to trade for horses to cross the Rockies. Despite his eagerness to locate members of the tribe, Clark could not go on. A painful boil on one of his ankles made it impossible for him to walk. As with Sacagawea's fever, the expedition could not delay for illness or injury. So Lewis set off with 3 men on foot, while Clark followed slowly by canoe with the others. Didn't take long for Lewis to find a few Shoshone. Women and children collecting food either took off running or fell to the ground when they saw the men approach. They were terrified and thought they were going to be killed or kidnapped. This was a crucial moment. If one of the women ran back to her camp and reported that there were hostile men in the area, they could be attacked. If they jeopardized their chances for getting those horses in any way, the entire tribe and expedition would be ruined. Lewis slowly reached into his pocket. The Shoshone cowered, but he did not take out a gun or a knife. Instead, he pulled out a little pot of red paint and gently applied it to the cheeks of the women. The paint was actually red earth that Sacagawea had pointed out to Lewis and Clark. She explained that the Shoshone used earth as face paint in a symbol of peace. Lewis, who had collected the earth in a small bottle, also gave the women gifts of beads, awls, those are small tools for punching holes, and pewter mirrors. The message came through loud and clear, and the women led Lewis and his men back to their camp. But as the men followed happily, they heard a loud rumble as if a huge thunderstorm was brewing. They turned just as 60 Shoshone warriors on their horses surrounded them. Facing the men, Lewis slowly held up a small U.S. flag as another sign of peace. The Indians hopped off their horses and got very close to Lewis and his team, who shivered with fear. Then the Indians raised their arms and gave the white men big hugs. Lewis was taken immediately to the chief, whose name was Kemehawait, meaning one who never walks. It was a good thing Lewis had studied his Indian customs so thoroughly. As everyone sat in a circle, he took off his moccasins. Lewis's action was an important Shoshone ritual that symbolized sincerity. If a person did not keep the promises he made during the council, the gesture said, he would go barefoot for the rest of his life. The Shoshone appreciated the gesture, but Lewis knew that if he was going to trade for the desperately needed horses, he needed Sacagawea. Through sign language and drawing, he asked Kemehawait and some of the tribe members to come back with him to the river fork, where the rest of the corps would be waiting. Chief wasn't confident about the idea. He didn't know Lewis and his men. They could easily be setting up an ambush. But Lewis convinced them that no harm would come to them. When they arrived at the meeting spot, nobody was there. Not Sacagawea, not Clark, not a soul. The situation grew tense. Kemehawait was suspicious. This had all the mappings of a trap. Lewis felt the silent pressure rising. If the Shoshone didn't trust him, they would either kill them or simply take off, riding away with their last chance for horses and essentially ending the expedition. He had to do something. Lewis slowly went for his guns. The Indians instantly raised their bows and arrows, but Lewis put up his hand to signal to stop. He took the gun out slowly and handed it to Kemehawait. Everyone, Indians and whites, were shocked. Then Lewis had the three corps members do the same. This was the ultimate sign of trust. It took until the next morning, nobody slept during the night, for a few small figures to appear, bobbing on the river in the distance. When the two groups were close enough to see each other, Sacagawea, who had been walking on the shore alongside the boats, was overcome with joy. She recognized the Indians, and they recognized her. The Corps hadn't just found the Shoshone. They had found Sacagawea's band, the Lenni. It seemed like a miracle. Reunited with the very people who had raised her, Sacagawea danced to show how happy she was. Back at the Lenni camp, Jumping Fish ran out of the crowd and rushed into Sacagawea's arms. They, two old friends who had been kidnapped together, embraced each other as if each couldn't believe the other woman was real. No one else could understand what they had been through. They had so much to tell each other. Sacagawea couldn't catch up for long. She had a job to do. The chief, Lewis and Clark, were already in the tent, making formal introductions. She opened up the flaps of the tent and silently took a seat with her head bowed. When she lifted up her gaze, she saw something even more incredible than Jumping Fish. Her brother was the chief. There were plenty of tears and hugging. Sadly, this was the only family reunion for Sacagawea. She soon learned from her brother that her parents and her sister were dead. It was hard for her to interpret all the emotions that she felt. Her new situation seemed to overpower her, and she was frequently interrupted by her tears. Clark wrote, "Through the tears and three languages, Sacagawea related the main point of their visit. Lewis and Clark needed horses for the next part of their expedition, crossing the Rockies. The chief wanted guns so they could put up more of a fight against Hidatsa. They made a deal. 29 horses in exchange for pistols, gunpowder, and knives." The Corps stayed with the Lenni as the captains consulted with Kemewait about the way to the ocean. Clark, still holding out hope of finding the Northwest Passage, went on a mini expedition on the rough rapids of the Lenni and Salmon Rivers, where he quickly realized the chief was right. The only way to travel was over the mountains. Too soon, the day came for Sacagawea to say goodbye to her friends and family. She didn't stay with the Lenni people. She had been raised in the band, but it was no longer her life. She had a husband to whom she belonged and a baby she needed to take care of. Plus, she needed to accompany Lewis and Clark on the last leg of their journey. Sacagawea knew this part of the country better than anyone else in the Corps. She had a job to do. Chapter 7. The journey is a success. The trek over the Rocky Mountains was harder than any of them could ever have imagined. At some points, the incline was so steep that even the sure-footed horses started to slip. The men would have to take the heavy loads off the horses and carry the supplies themselves until the ground leveled off again. It was not yet winter. Still, snow came up to their knees as they got higher, and sleet froze the rest of their bodies. On top of all this, food was running low. There were no berries to gather or deer to be hunted. They met up with a small group of Indians who kindly gave them some of their food and traded a few tired horses for new ones, but they couldn't rest long. They needed to push ahead in order to make their goal of reaching the Pacific before real winter set in. The core, weak and freezing, was miserable. I have been wet and as cold in every part as I ever was in my life. Indeed, I was at one time fearful my feet would freeze in the thin moccasins which I wore, Clark wrote. When they stumbled out onto the Wapee Prairie, they were exhausted and starving, but alive. The friendly Nez Perce tribe greeted them with food that the Corps gratefully feasted on. The dried fish and berries the Indians offered were so delicious the men gorged on them until they became sick. After the travelers regained their strength, the Indians gave them good news. The Pacific was only 12 days away, but there was also bad news. The 3 rivers they had to travel to get there had some fierce and dangerous rapids. A couple of Nez Perce Indians went with the Corps to help them navigate the rough water of the Clearwater River. On October 16th, 9 days after leaving the prairie, they made it to the Columbia River, which would take them directly to the ocean. Their destination was so close, yet so far away. By early November, they were only about 20 miles from the ocean, but they had to stop and make camp. The river was rocking everyone with waves, making everyone seasick. With winter almost upon them, they stopped to build a camp on the Pacific coast. They named the camp Fort Clatsop in honor of the Indians who lived in the area. It never seemed to stop raining that winter. The Corps had to eat rotting meat because there was no way to dry it, and the camp was infested with biting fleas. When Clark fell ill due to the damp weather, Sacagawea had the opportunity to repay him for the way he had nursed her back to health earlier in their journey. Not long after New Year's Day in 1806, the Corps heard from local Indians that a whale had washed ashore not too far from the camp. Lewis and Clark decided to take a few men all the way to the shoreline so that they could get meat and blubber to eat. Sacagawea, who wasn't part of the group, spoke up. She hadn't come all this way with a baby on her back not to see the ocean. It must have been hard for her to speak her mind, but no harder than traveling 4,000 miles in the harsh wild. The trip took 5 days of treacherous rowing and climbing. And when they arrived at the present-day site of Cannon Beach, Oregon, the whale was nothing but a skeleton picked clean by animals and Indians. Still, Sacagawea reached her goal, to see the great big sea. Chapter 8, Saying Goodbye. On March 23rd, 1806, the Corps of Discovery turned around to make the long trek home. Going back seemed like it would be easier since they were driven by the satisfaction of achieving their goal and also knew where they were going. But they had one last big scare. While the group was staying with the Nez Perce again, Baptiste got sick. For 18 days, the little baby, who had been over mountains and to the sea, was deathly ill. Lewis and Clark tended to him night and day and wrote about his condition in their journals. Everyone was worried he was going to die. The captains applied onion poultices to his swollen neck until finally the infection cleared. Baptiste survived. In June, the Corps headed back into the Rockies. Only this time, they had 5 guides from the Nez who knew the mountains like the backs of their hands. The trip that had taken 11 days the previous fall took only 6. Once they had cleared the Rockies, Lewis and Clark split up to find different routes back to the Mandan villages. Sacagawea went with Clark's group to the Yellowstone River. While on their way to the river, the trail opened onto 2 different mountain passes. Clark didn't know which one led to the Yellowstone, but Sacagawea did. This was the land of the Shoshone, where she had been raised. August 14, 1806, 1 year and 4 months after the journey began, the Corps of Discovery arrived back in Fort Mandan. Lewis and Clark never found the water passageway, but they did their job. They mapped the land, found a route, noted the vegetation and geology, and made contact with the Indians. And they never could have done it without Sacagawea, whom Clark said has been of great service to me as a pilot through this country. Saying goodbye was almost as hard as making the trip. Clark, who truly came to love Baptiste, wanted to adopt the little boy and give him an education. Charbonneau and Sacagawea declined the kind offer. Their adventure had been amazing, but now it was over. Chapter 9, Sacagawea's Mysterious Death. 3 years after the expedition, Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and Jean-Baptiste had a change of heart and decided to join Clark in St. Louis. Charbonneau, of course, was motivated by a congressional grant of 300 acres of land. They only stayed for 2 years before they were back on the road. After Charbonneau sold his land to Clark for $100 and left Baptiste to be educated by the lieutenant, he and Sacagawea joined an expedition to start a fur trading post up the Missouri River. Sacagawea remained in Fort Manuel along the Missouri River in present-day South Dakota, where she gave birth to a daughter named Lisette in August 1812. The fort's clerk, John Ludig, wrote the news of the day in his journal. On Sunday, December 10th, he sadly reported that this evening, the wife of Charbonneau, a snake squaw, died of a putrid fever. She was a good and the best woman in the fort, aged about 25 years. She left a fine infant daughter. From the written evidence, most historians believe Sacagawea returned to South Dakota with Charbonneau in 1811 and died there a year later. However, there is a second story that has Sacagawea living to the ripe old age of 94 on the Wind River, Shoshone Reservation in Wyoming. People who claim to know Sacagawea included teachers, farmers, and even the minister who attended the funeral in 1884. Saka history is not always cut and dry. When you go back into the past, especially far back, it can get confusing. Scholars read different accounts from many people to try and figure out what really happened and what it means. Though no one can really be sure about Sacagawea's death, everyone can agree that she was a true American hero because she pushed herself beyond the definition others gave her. Sacagawea is the definition of a trailblazer. 10 things you should know about her. She was born in 78 or 79 in the area now called Salmon, Idaho. She was an Indian from the Lemhi tribe band of the Shoshone tribe. In 1800, when she was about 11, she was kidnapped by the Hidatsa tribe and taken to live in their village. She married a French-Canadian fur trader, Toussaint Charbonneau, and had a baby boy named Jean-Baptiste on February 11, 1805. In the spring of 1805, Sacagawea and her family joined the Corps of Discovery, the expedition led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to find a route from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean. Sacagawea not only spoke 2 Indian languages, Hidatsa and Shoshone, which helped her translate for the Corps, she also made encounters with Indian tribes easier because the Indians assumed any group traveling with a woman was peaceful. When Sacagawea reunited with her band of the Lemhi Shoshone in 1805, she discovered that her brother, Kamiway, had become chief. She helped secure horses from the Shoshone, which the Corps needed to make it over the Rocky Mountains and complete their journey. Sacagawea insisted that she join the small group who went all the way to the Pacific Ocean in the beginning of 1806. Historians can't agree on when Sacagawea died. It was either at the age of 25 or 94. A few other interesting facts. Believing they were descended from wolves, the Shoshone tribe considered coyotes and dogs close relatives. Clark was a big fan of nicknames. He gave the nickname Janie to Sacagawea, and called Jean-Baptiste Pompey. Sucking on fingers when Sacagawea did when she was reunited with the Lemhi after kidnapping was a Shoshone sign for family. The Corps of Discovery met nearly 50 different Indian tribes during the expedition. Charbonneau was paid $500.33 for the expedition. Sacagawea, of course, was paid nothing. Clark measured the length of the expedition from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean at 4,162 miles. Based on modern measurements, he was only off by about 40 miles. The debate over Sacagawea's place and date of death got so heated that a private investigator, Charles Eastman, was sent from South Dakota to snoop around Wyoming in 1925. The evidence he found led him to believe that she had died on a reservation at 94. When Baptiste was 18 years old, he met a German prince and traveled back with him to Europe, where he remained for 6 years. When he returned to the United States, he became a wilderness guide. There are more monuments to Sacagawea in the United States than to any other woman. Sacagawea replaced Susan B. Anthony on the dollar coin in January 2000. This is what the teepees look like. Let me see. I keep losing my, let's see. Here we go. The teepees. Let's see if we can get next page. And that, my friends, is the end of the story of Sacagawea. It's just so interesting to read history, to meet people that we hear about, probably in history classes, or, somebody may have seen a Sacagawea dollar coin and wondered, who is this woman on this coin, this dollar coin? And it's always good to hear stories about heroes and about people who are always considered less than others. For example, our Native American brothers and sisters. Let us keep them in prayer and keep women also in prayer. It is important that we recognize that God created us all equal, and God is good. Have a nice weekend. We won't be coming back to Storytime until probably September or at the end of summer. It's been wonderful being able to come into your homes and share these delightful stories. And so I thank you very much. Enjoy your summer.